we look around and we see things that no matter how hard we try to process it, we can't understand why it's happening. We can't understand what God could possibly be doing. Why is he allowing this virus to continue to run rampant? Why is he allowing the wars to continue to happen in this world, the social injustice, the disease and the famine and all of it? Why? It just doesn't make any sense. Not from a loving God. And I actually started this message months ago. But as with many of the messages that I do, God will lay something on my heart and I'll start making notes about it, and then he has me put it aside for some time later. And as I was going through the different messages that I had started and praying about what he wanted me to talk about, it's funny because I went through 6 or 7 different messages that I had started. And when I got to this one, it was like he hit the pause button. And it's just, bless you. So let's look at perspective. Let's look at God's perspective. Perspective is so important, and you guys know this. But we look at things from a human perspective. Sometimes I don't think we try to look at things from God's perspective because we think there's no way we can know. How can we know God's perspective? Well, that's what I want to talk about. But let's talk about the importance of perspective just for a second here. You guys, when we're trying to see a picture in the proper perspective, distance is always important. Distance is always important because if we're too close, we don't see the entire picture. Okay? If you're holding a picture up to your face, especially a bigger one, all you're going to see is what's right in front of your eyes. You're not going to see the rest of it. Okay? And if we're too far away, we can't see enough of the picture. We might be able to catch a glimpse of a silhouette or something like that, but we can't see the whole picture. And you guys, that distance can be due to the things that we know or don't know, and our understanding of that information, our perspective of that information. All of us have grown up in different situations. We've grown up in different places. We've grown up with different values. All those things impact our perspective on things. All of those things do. The problem is, all of those things are based on human experience, human perspective, not necessarily God's perspective. Even people that grow up in churches, a lot of times don't look at things from God's perspective. This is a great example of perspective. Guy's yelling boat, another guy's yelling land. They're both going to be utterly disappointed. Okay? Yeah. Job's a great example. Job is a great example of perspective. Job had known of God, but only through his trials and his obedience. Only through his trials and obedience. So he knew God, he knew who God was, but it was only through his trials and his obedience that he experienced God personally. And I think all of us can probably attest to that. That we know God. We're baptized. We sing songs to him and all that. But it's only in those times of trials that we truly come to know God. Now, many scholars, and I want to explain something here, and this is one of those things you can take it for what it's worth, okay? But many scholars believe the prologue in the book of Job is a later addition to the book. In other words, man again trying to help God out like he would need it, okay? Think about this. does Satan really ask permission to hurt people? And does Satan, hey, you know that woman that's getting ready to have a baby, I want to kill that baby. Is that okay? You think God's going to go, yeah, go ahead. Really? I'm not the God I serve, okay? Not the God I serve. The point isn't whether Satan has to ask permission to inflict pain, to inflict suffering on God's creation. It's there to emphasize the spiritual war that we're part of. That's what it's about. Because just like in Job's case, Job couldn't see what was going on. Whether Satan asked permission of God or not is pretty much irrelevant. The point is, Job lost everything. And in losing everything, he still did not dishonor God. He still did not do it. It's to illustrate the fact that there's so much more that we don't see, that we can't understand, that only God can see and understand, okay? But it was through that suffering that Job truly came to see God. In fact, think about what he says, because his perspective was so much narrower than God's that it was only when he went through what he did that he could actually say, I had only heard about you before, but now I have seen you with my own eyes. Now I have seen you with my own eyes. Job 42, that's the end of Job. Job is saying, I heard about you before, but now I've seen you. Because when Job was questioning God, when Job was basically throwing down the gauntlet with him, finally God said, okay, let's take the gloves off. Where were you when I laid out the foundations of the earth, when I told the shores, the water, they had to stop? Okay, and what did Job do? Job ate crow. Job humbled himself. He said, who am I to question the Almighty? And we have to remember that sometimes when we can't see the whole picture. Only if, you guys, only if we could see things as God does. But you know what? To a certain extent, we can. And that's what I want to reemphasize here, okay? As we get closer to God, we begin to see things more the way He sees them, okay? And as we learn more about Jesus and how He lived among us, we get a much better picture of how our Father in heaven sees things. So it's not like we are completely incapable of seeing things the way God does, okay? All it takes to open our heart to seeing things from God's perspective is to surrender our opinions, humble ourselves, and do what God does. Love those who hate us, bless those who curse us, and pray for those who use us. You all know what that feels like. Because one of the things that happens to God's people when they're truly trying to serve God the way they should is that they are going to be used, they are going to be taken advantage of, they are going to be slapped in the face, okay? They're going to be spit on. And if we don't humble ourselves, if we think ourselves better, we're never going to accomplish anything. Obviously, being close to a situation, like I said a little earlier, can distort our view. This is from an author in our Daily Bread, and I think it illustrates the point beautifully. I was deeply troubled and woke in the night to pace the floor and pray. Frankly, my attitude was not one of prayerful submission to God. How many times have we been there, okay? We're praying, but we're really not thinking about submitting, okay? But one of questioning and anger. Finding no release, I sat and stared out at a large window at the night sky. I was unexpectedly drawn to focus on Orion's belt. Those three perfectly arranged stars, often visible on clear nights. I knew just enough about astronomy to understand that those three stars were hundreds of light years apart. A long, long, long way apart. I realized the closer I could get to those stars, the less they would appear to be aligned. Yet from my distant perspective, they looked carefully configured in the heavens. At that moment, I realized I was too close to my life to see what God sees. In his big picture, everything is in perfect alignment. In his big picture, everything is in perfect alignment. Yet, we can't see that because we can't see the picture the way God does. Think about pictures that we see from space of the earth. Depending on how much you zoom in, you can zoom pretty much. We can zoom now. We've got the technology. I can go to Google Maps and zoom right into my house. But the more you pull back, the less detail you see, but the more you see of the outline of this country and then maybe our hemisphere. And as you pull back even farther, you see that the earth is a blue marble, or it looks like a blue marble floating in space. Those are perspectives that we didn't have a half a century ago. Think about that. It's not been that long that we've been able to have that perspective. But we have a perspective now that we never had before, but God has seen that all along. Yeah. So let's talk about the depth of God's wisdom, because it's important to understand that we can trust him. The New Passion Translation, which is a pretty cool translation, it says in Romans 11, who could ever wrap their minds around the riches of God, the depth of his wisdom, and the marvel of his perfect knowledge? Who could ever explain the wonder of his decisions or search out the mysterious way he carries out his plans? For who has discovered how the Lord thinks or is wise enough to be the one to advise him on his plans? And that's essentially what he said to Job. Where were you when I did all this? If you know, tell me. Okay? Because how many times have we prayed? I know I have. Where I'm questioning him. I'm mad at him because I can't understand why he's allowing something to happen. And he doesn't get mad at me. He doesn't yell at me. As a matter of fact, I think when we are praying like that, when we're mad, God is happy. Not because we're being insubordinate or anything like that, but because we're not going to have an argument like that with somebody we don't believe in. So he knows that we know in our hearts that he's there, or else we wouldn't be that passionate about talking to him. Or who has ever first given something to God that obligates God to owe him something in return? And because God is the source and the sustainer of everything, everything finds fulfillment in him. May all praise and honor be given to him forever. Amen. And in Corinthians, we're told, for who can know the Lord's thoughts? Who knows enough to teach him? But, now remember, this Paul saying this. Paul says, but we understand these things, and for we have the mind of Christ. We have the mind of Christ. Remember what 1 Corinthians says just a little bit before this. It says that until we accept Christ in our hearts, we can read the Bible all day long, and even though some of it may make sense, we're never going to get it the way we're intended to get it, because the Spirit is what speaks to us. The Spirit is what tells us what some of those hard things to understand are. And that's what he's saying here. We have the mind of Christ. When we ask Christ into our heart, and his Spirit comes, or the Spirit of God comes to live inside of us, okay, then that helps us understand the heart of God. And that's what Paul's trying to say. And the closer we get to God's heart, the better we understand. And even if we can understand, the closer we are to God's heart, the easier it is for us to kind of look the other way when we're mistreated, or to forgive those that mistreat us. It just gives us, it allows us to see better what God's perspective is. I mean, think about poor Pete. Think about Pete. In Mark 8:33, Jesus turned around and looked at his disciples, then reprimanded Peter. Get away from me, Satan, he said. You are seeing things merely from a human point of view and not from God's. We're all guilty of that. We see something from human point of view and not what God, and think about this. Right before that is when Jesus said, "Who do you say I am?" And Peter says, "You are the Christ. You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." And what's Jesus say? Spot on, baby. And because of that, you are blessed. And it was only the Father who revealed that to you. Okay? Now that was right before he's calling him Satan. Now talk about a roller coaster of emotions. Holy cow. But poor Pete, and Pete was impetuous. We've talked about that many times. And as long as we talk about the Bible, we talk about Peter, we're going to talk about his impetuousness. Okay? Even when things seem confusing, God's divine plans are unfolding for our good and for God's honor and glory. Always. Peter wanted to hear nothing about Jesus' death. No, wait. That's not going to happen. Now, you can understand why. Think about it. Think about you're with somebody you absolutely adore, that you respect, that you can't say enough about them, and they tell you they're going to die. Not because they're sick, okay, but because they're going to be murdered. No, I'll never let that happen. I won't let that happen. He was looking at it through human eyes, but Jesus was looking at it through God's eyes. He was looking at it through God's eyes. But we got to remember, this can't be said enough, that God uses all things, all things, all things. So when that baby dies, Lori and I know of a couple that we used to go to church with. And they found out probably 5 or 6 months into the pregnancy that even though the baby was still alive inside the mom, that more than likely the moment that the child was born, if it was still alive, it would die. And so they had a horrific decision to make. But they opted to carry the baby to term. And Laura, I don't remember, did she die before she was born or as soon as she was born? Okay. With the brain, wasn't it? Yeah. But you know what? People would think, why would you do something like that? Why would you put yourself through something like that? Well, one, they felt like God wanted them to do it, that it was up to God to decide if the baby was going to live or die. But in the process, God used that. God didn't cause that. God didn't do that to that baby. But God used it. And that couple ended up, the hospital that they were going through asked them if they would counsel with people that were dealing with like circumstances. And if I'm not mistaken, they even started like an online thing, didn't they, Laura, where they were actually ministering to people all over the country and I think all over the world about situations like this. So even though it was a horrific thing for them, they didn't get mad at God. They continued to love God. They continued to obey God, and God used that in an incredible way. They were trying to see things from God's perspective, and God bless them. They did. They did. We need to see it from God's perspective as much as we possibly can. Doesn't it seem like that? This is where it ends, 2020. I keep waiting for Jesus to show up any second because, man, it just seems like, Henry keeps saying it, it's going to happen tomorrow. It might happen today. And Henry's convinced, okay? He's not giving dates, okay? He's not giving dates, but he's convinced it's going to happen real soon. Think about it. Think about it. It does feel like that. We've got disease running rampant. War is everywhere, okay? Floods, dust storms, huge dust storms that have come from Africa to cover our country, the southern part of our country. Global economic crash. Not just a crash in the country, the entire world economies were crashing, okay? 2 hurricanes hitting the South at once, not one, but 2. Social unrest, political upheaval and divisiveness, earthquakes in Michigan. There was an earthquake last week in Michigan. Are you kidding me? But you know what? Jesus tells us that's just the beginning. That's just the beginning. That's just the beginning. But God will use it all for good, you guys. He will use it all for good. And oh, by the way, this happens every year. Just to, some things are more extent, some things are lesser extent, but all this stuff happens every year. Every bit of it happens every year somewhere in this world, including especially in our country. All right? But it wasn't always this way. It wasn't always this way. The Bible tells us in Genesis that when God created, everything was good. And God was pleased, and God was happy. Think about that. Everything was good. Do you know the Bible tells us that man and animals ate nothing but vegetation when he first created? Basically, lions and bears and humans all kind of hung out together. I mean, think about it. He brought all the animals to Adam. What, do you have a gun as the bears and the lions and the tigers approached him, so in case they got wicked, he could kill them? You told me I was going to do that one time. I'm going to come back up here again just to see if I can do it right the next time. In Exodus, it tells us, it says, Son of man, sing this funeral song for the king of Tyre. Give him this message from the sovereign Lord. You were the model of perfection, full of wisdom and exquisite in beauty. Exquisite in beauty. Okay? Now, this next line ought to tell us they're not talking to the king of Tyre. Do you think the king of Tyre was in Eden? No. You were in Eden, the garden of God. Your clothing was adorned with every precious stone and beautifully crafted for you and set in the finest gold. They were given to you on the day you were created. So that tells us right there, Satan wasn't eternal. He was created like everything else God created. I ordained and anointed you as the mighty angelic guardian. When you're the mighty angelic guardian, that means you're the head of all the angels, okay? You had access to the holy mountain of God. You had access to the holy mountain of God. And walked among the stones of fire. You were blameless. We're talking about Satan. You were blameless in all you did from the day you were created until the day evil was found in you. Wow. So how is this relevant to what we're talking about? Well, I'm glad you asked. We're being told here Satan was an incredibly beautiful creature. Incredibly beautiful, adorned in the best God had to offer. Okay? Perhaps the most beautiful and powerful, I would certainly say not perhaps, he was. Okay? It tells us, the Bible tells us as much. He was the guardian cherub. That would possibly indicate that Satan was the angel who guarded God's presence. Guarded his presence. Okay? Like God would need that, but still, that tells you how important Satan, or Lucifer at this time, Lucifer was. Lucifer's not a bad thing. Please understand what I'm saying here. Lucifer is not a bad thing, at least at this point. But pride led to Lucifer's fall. I should have had Lucifer up there. And his rebellion resulted in God casting him from his presence and his will, eventually resulting in God condemning him to the lake of fire. All right? Satan, like Satan, the human king of Tyre was prideful. he was prideful. A lot of people think either this is it's referring to Satan, but he's using the king of Tyre because either Satan possessed him or because of the king's pride and because of what happened to him in the end. He's drawn an analogy with him, but the point is, we know the king of Tyre wasn't in Eden and certainly wasn't on God's holy mountain, okay? Just as Satan's pride led to his fall and will eventually lead to his eternal destruction, so will the city of Tyre lose its wealth and power and status. Ezekiel's prophecy of Tyre's total destruction was fulfilled partially by Nebuchadnezzar, that we're told in Ezekiel, and ultimately by Alexander the Great. It happened, okay? You guys, we have no idea how long God's creation remained perfect after Lucifer's creation. We have no idea. It could have went on for billions of years, okay? It could have went on, because we're talking about eternity here. We have no idea how long everything was good. Isaiah says, "How you are fallen from heaven, O shining star, O shining star." Remember, Lucifer means morning star. So we're talking about Satan here. We're talking about before he fell. Son of the morning. He's called morning star. That really tells you right there. Okay? You have been thrown down to the earth, you who destroyed the nations of the world. In Revelation it says, a great red dragon, his tail swept away 1/3 of the stars in the sky. The stars, in biblical terminology, often refers to angels. Okay? I could get into a big, long discussion about it, but I won't. Just please, don't take my word for it. Go look it up, okay, if you have trouble believing me. 1/3 of the stars from the sky, and he threw them down to the earth. Obviously now Satan means adversary. Lucifer meant morning star. Satan means adversary. In verses, again in 12, but verses 7 through 9, it says, "Then there was war in heaven. Michael and his angels fought against the dragon and his angels." So we're getting confirmation here that that's who this is all about. "And the dragon lost the battle, and he and his angels were forced out of heaven. This great dragon, the ancient serpent called the devil or Satan." Do we need any more confirmation? No, we don't. It's right there. "The one deceiving the whole world was thrown down to the earth with his angels." Are you starting to see the picture here? Okay? Everything was perfect. Everything was great. God's creation was beautiful. It was moving along. There was no sin in the world. But Satan, his pride, created an issue. He was cast down to earth with a bunch of other of his buddies. And let me talk about that a little bit. You guys, God does his work through angels. And it is God who makes the decision to direct an angel to do his bidding. It's not the angel's decision to act independently from God. And that's what Satan was trying to do, okay? Angels carry out God's judgment. They serve him. They praise him. They're his messengers. They protect God's people. They don't marry. They don't die. And they encourage people. I was getting a haircut the other day. And my barber, he's an interesting character to say the least. He's the one that I did my message about, Pete, his dog. He's an interesting guy. And he was talking about a couple of things that changed his life. And he said, this is the first time he's ever told me the story. It was a couple of days ago. He said he and his son, who is now 26, were out in Colorado, and they were at the Four Corners. And evidently there's a place out there where you are in a parking lot, and then you walk across this bridge, but you don't know it until you get to this pinnacle, basically, where there's a guardrail, that you're 400 feet in the air. And he said he and his son were standing there, and he said this little 3-year-old boy couldn't see over the rail, so he put himself in the prone position, and he hooked his feet on the rail, and all of a sudden his weight was out where and all Mike could hear is, ah, ah. Now Mike said he was like from here to here away, And then there was a lady. He said she had to been in her late 70s, early 80s. And he said he saw her reach down, grab the kid by the scruff of the neck, and pull him up and hold him there. Now, 70, I don't know of too many almost 80-year-old women that could pick a 25 or 30-pound kid up like that and hold him in front of their face. And then she said something about little boys like you can end up dying doing stuff like that or something like that. And Mike said, I saw where his father is. And Mike took the kid and walked, he said, not even 10 feet. And he said, that lady, and he turned, she was gone. And he said, Tom, and Kyle was actually in the barbershop that day. He said, there's no way in the world that lady would have had to walk 50 yards before she'd have been out. I mean, he said it was that quick. He took the child, he walked 10 feet, and he said, that lady, and she was gone. You can believe what you want to believe, okay? But I'm thinking an 80-year-old woman doing that, yeah, okay? So they protect God's people, and they encourage them. And Hebrews 12:22 tells us that the number of angels is innumerable. That means there's a lot of them, okay? So 1/3 of that unbelievable number are now working against God, and they're working against his will. So I go back to this list. You guys, this is the work of Satan and all those fallen angels. That's what this is, okay? That's what we're in the middle of. That's the perspective that we don't see. God tells us in his word that all this stuff happened, and that's what we're caught in the middle of, but sometimes I don't think we really get it. Sometimes I don't think it really hits us between the eyes. And then something terrible happens, and we go, what's going on? Why did God allow this? We don't know. We have a distorted view, you guys. We have a distorted view, all right? The creation is corrupted. We're caught in the middle of that spiritual battle that we cannot comprehend. His perspective, his view, his picture is something that we can't see. He has to allow things we cannot see or understand to continue to happen. And one of them is destroying Satan. You have to understand that when Satan, look, if our God is loving, his understanding is the Bible tells us, I don't believe that as soon as God picked up a little bit of pride in Satan, he immediately banned him. I'm thinking that just like with us, he gave him opportunity after opportunity after opportunity to repent and to realize that his beauty and his glory wasn't his doing, it was God's. So if Satan, or if God would have immediately destroyed Satan, what message would that have sent to the rest of the angels? You follow me or you're destroyed, like that's not love. He had to let this play out the way it has so that in the end, he's vindicated by our own actions, by Satan's actions, okay? We might not be able to understand that, but that's what's going on. If he was just to slam the door, then all of us would be living in fear. And unfortunately, that's what religion has taught people about God. Boy, if you don't do this, you're going to burn in hell. Look what he did to Satan. They don't stop to say, they don't stop to ask the question, how many times do you think God gave Satan an opportunity? If Jesus is telling us we have to forgive 70 times 7, how many times did God probably look past what Satan was doing, or Lucifer at the time, because he wanted him to turn back to him? See, God has a clear picture. And you know what? We know how this ends, you guys. We know that he's not going to prevail. Satan is not going to prevail. We know that in the end, all those that love the Lord are going to live with him forever in a place where there is no sin. It's just a matter of being able to ride it out, okay? And that can be tough. But we got to trust. We got to trust. We got to listen. We got to keep pushing forward so that we can finish the race. I don't need to read that again. All right? It says the same thing as it did when I put it up there before. As does this. Only if we could see things from God's perspective. All right? And the closer we get to Him, the more we can. We all practiced being people after God's own heart. What if we did that? What if we just practiced being people after God's own heart? Our perspective would be so much clearer. It would be so much